Cold is the second worst damage type in D&D when looking at how many creatures in the monster manual resist or immune it compared to other types of damage. So if for whatever reason you're looking for spells that can deal this type of damage, in this list we'll be going over some of the best spells in the game that technically can deal this type of damage. And starting us off at number 10, we have Ice Knife. This is a first level spell with a range of 60 feet and requires the caster to make a ranged spell attack against a creature in order to deal 1d10 piercing damage to it. Whether you hit or miss, however, the shards of ice explode, dealing damage to both the target and creatures within 5 feet of it for 2d6 cold damage if they fail a dexterity saving throw. Now, what's neat about this spell is that you can use it to target both a creature's AC and dexterity saving throw at the same time, while also dealing AoE damage to surrounding targets. This also means that you effectively have 2 chances to hit a single target and 1 chance to hit targets within 5 feet of the initial target. Being able to deal damage in a 3x3 space for a first level spell slot from 60 feet away is pretty good, since not many spells at first level are able to deal both AoE damage while also sporting decent range. Spells like Burning Hands and Frost Fingers both create a 15-foot cone, meaning you'll have to risk putting yourself in harm's way in order to cast them, while Tasha's Caustic Brew shoots a 30-foot line from you, making it hard to aim. However, there are some major downsides to using this spell. Firstly, this spell is essentially a save or suck spell, a phrase commonly used in D&D 5e to describe a spell or effect that either works or just doesn't, unlike other spells that will still do a half damage if a target passes their saving throw against it. If you cannot hit a creature with this spell, they don't take the piercing damage. If they pass a dexterity saving throw, they also don't take the cold damage. The other downside is that you can't target this spell the same way you would other area effect spells like Fireball or Shatter, which both allow you to choose a point in order to cast the spell. The spell description says that you specifically must target a creature in order to be able to use the spell. So for instance, if your fighter was fighting in front of 2 goblins that are standing 5 feet from each other, hitting either of the goblins would cause Ice Knife to also hit your fighter. You wouldn't be able to hit the square behind the goblins in order to force a dex save on them because you're not targeting a creature. This is further cemented by the fact that spells like Firebolt and Disintegrate both let you target a creature or object in their descriptions. So while this spell is a pretty good option for AoE at the first level, the reason Ice Knife takes the number 10 spot on this list is because the spell gets outclassed as soon as you reach second level spells, where spells like Shatter exists, which has a bigger radius, better damage, a target that is not a creature, and it applies even if the creature passes their saving throw against it. And at number 9, we have Fire Shield. This is a 4th level wizard spell which basically grants a shield that gives you resistance to your choice of either cold or fire damage for 10 minutes. After which, any creature that hits you with a melee attack erupts the shield, dealing 2d8 damage of the opposing damage type to whatever you're currently resisting. If you're using a warm shield to resist cold damage, you will deal fire damage. And if you're using a cold shield to resist fire damage, you'll deal cold damage to the melee attackers. This spell also emits bright light in 10 feet, and another 10 feet of dim light after that, which might have some niche uses when it comes to lighting up dark corridors or rooms. Being resistant to cold or fire damage is a beneficial effect to have since both are common types of damage, with fire being the more common of the two. This shield also serves as a deterrent against enemies that might want to charge in and start attacking you, since 2d8 damage every time they hit can add up very quickly because of multi-attack, a feature that allows many enemies to make additional attacks on their turn. Unfortunately, to get the maximum benefit out of this spell, you need to be in a position where you'll be taking as many melee hits as possible. This isn't a great position for a wizard. However, if you're playing as an Eldritch Knight fighter, you can eventually learn this spell and use it to good effect. The problem with this is Eldritch Knight fighters would learn this spell at level 19, which is way too late in the game to make good use of Fire Shield, because you would have access to much better spells and utility options for dealing with cold and fire damage, such as Shield or Absorb Elements, which are 2 very good first level spells which use your reaction in order to cast. Absorb Elements already grants resistance against an incoming damage type from its list until the start of your next turn, while also adding the damage to your next melee attack as a 1d6. Shield grants you +5 to your AC until the start of your next turn, which prevents taking damage at all. If the creatures you're fighting have access to range options, then this spell is useless since Fire Shield's damage only works on melee attacks. The reason this spell only lands at number 9 on this list is because, while this spell works well as a defensive option if you want to deal some extra damage against a creature, wizards have access to spells at lower levels that work better as a way to avoid or deal extra damage to creatures. You have Shield, Absorb Elements, or Silvery Barbs as reactions, which all have the great effects that mitigate damage. Or if it's your turn and the enemy is on top of you, Shocking Grasp is a cantrip that shuts down an enemy's reaction when it hits, so that you can safely move to a better position without provoking opportunity attacks. If you wanted to expend a higher level slot, Misty Step works great at repositioning yourself because it allows you to teleport up to 30 feet to an occupied space that you can see. And at number 8, we have Wall of Ice. This is a 6th level concentration spell with a range of 120 feet that allows you to create a wall of ice that is 1 foot thick for up to 10 minutes. This can be especially useful for denying enemies a location, such as a walkway, doorway, etc., etc. The wall can be made into a hemispherical dome or a sphere with a radius of up to 10 feet, or you can shape a flat surface made up to 10 10-foot square panels. If you erect the wall inside a space occupied by a creature, the creature is pushed to the side and must make a dexterity saving throw or take 10d6 cold damage if it fails, or half if it succeeds. The wall can be destroyed and has an AC of 12, vulnerability to fire damage, 30 hit points per 10 foot of wall. However, if the sections get destroyed, they leave behind a sheet of frigid air, which deals 5d6 cold damage to creatures that move through it for the first time on their turn, unless they succeed a constitution saving throw in order to take half damage. If you want a spell that can completely deny creatures access to certain parts of the map, then this spell is great since the wall must be destroyed first, which will take time. By then, your party might have successfully retreated or have readied actions for when the wall is down. Another way you can use this spell is to separate and split enemy ranks, forcing part of the enemy to find another way around or waste time destroying the wall, while your party focuses on the enemies that are trapped with your party. Being able to force enemies into smaller, more manageable groups for the party is a really good form of crowd control that doesn't require any sort of saving throws, it's just good placement. But the thing about this spell is that there are other spells that does what Wall of Ice does, but better and much sooner. Wall of Force, for example, is learned at 5th level and creates an invisible wall of force that prevents anything from physically passing through it, and can't be dispelled with Dispel Magic either. Wall of Stone is a 5th level spell that essentially does the same thing as Wall of Ice, just without the damage component attached to it. Meanwhile, Wall of Fire is a 4th level spell that doesn't necessarily stop creatures from passing it, but will damage them for 5d8 fire damage when they pass through, making it a successful deterrent. And while 10d6 cold damage the moment you cast the spell on top of enemies is a good amount of damage for a 6th level spell, you do not get to choose which side of the wall the enemies end up on like you do for other spells, like Wall of Stone. If you must cast the spell on top of enemies to get effective use out of it, you might consider other options instead, as this spell is mostly meant to be used defensively. In fact, there are other spells you can use offensively that are much better and easier to use, some of which that deal cold damage and are on this very list, which is why Wall of Ice only sits at the number 8 spot. And coming in at number 7, we have Ray of Frost, a cantrip with a range of 60 feet that has the simple effect of dealing 1d8 cold damage to a creature whenever it hits, and reducing the target's movement speed by 10 feet until the start of your next turn. And the damage of the cantrip scales just like normal cantrips. Being able to reduce a creature's movement by 10 feet can have a big impact. If an encounter has a lot of melee-based enemies, such as ghouls with a base movement speed of 30 feet, Ray of Frost can do an excellent job at keeping them from getting close, since the ghoul would only be able to move 20 feet now. If you have a ranged party member maintaining a 30-foot range from a ghoul affected by Ray of Frost, the ghoul would have to use both its movement and action in order to dash to them or change its attention to something closer. And since this spell is a cantrip, it has an unlimited amount of uses, making this spell readily available whenever you need it. The only real problem with this spell are the fact that it only has a range of 60 feet, which is usually good for most spells, but if you want a spell that impairs the movement speed of enemies, then this spell leaves a lot to be desired. Not to mention the fact that this spell only targets one creature, meaning that its effectiveness is diminished when encountering multiple enemies. You could twin spell Ray of Frost as a sorcerer in order to hit 2 enemies instead of 1, but if there are multiple enemies in an encounter, then chances are you'll want to opt into better spells that might end the encounter quickly, rather than trying to hinder the enemies. The reason Ray of Frost only makes it number 7 on this list is because the spell only shines when it's being used creatively. It does not have as much of an impact compared to damaging enemies down before they can act. You only really want to use this spell when something is within 30 to 60 feet range, and even then, there are plenty of options that just work better than Ray of Frost when it comes to impairing enemy movement. And at number 6, we have Cone of Cold. This is a 5th level spell that creates a 60-foot cone from yourself that deals 8d8 cold damage to the creatures that fail a constitution saving throw, and half damage if they succeed. Being able to deal 8d8 cold damage in a 60-foot cone can be incredibly good against large groups of creatures that may be approaching the party from a singular direction. A 60-foot cone covers a lot more ground than even a fireball, meaning that this spell can hit creatures that are much more spread out. Another advantage this spell can have over fireball is that since it targets constitution, you can hit creatures that have the evasion feature. Although this might be a pretty niche way of using Cone of Cold, it's at least worth noting considering Cone of Cold only deals damage with no other forms of utility. Instead, you may look to other 5th level spells that do a good amount of damage while also providing extra benefits to your party, such as Hypnotic Static, which is basically a psychic damage fireball that also subtracts a d6 roll to the creature's attack rolls, ability checks, and concentration checks for 1 minute, while also being on an intelligence save, the best stat to target in the game. However, if range is something you feel is lacking in your spell list, then Cone of Cold is still a decent spell to take, which is why it still ranks higher than the previous spells. It gives you another way to deal group damage that might otherwise be unachievable with other spells. And at number 5, we have Ice Storm. This is a 4th level spell with a range of 300 feet and creates a cylinder of hail of ice which covers a 20-foot radius, 40-foot high area centered on a point within range. The storm itself turns the entire area of effect into difficult terrain until the end of your next turn, and any creatures inside the storm take 2d8 bludgeoning damage and 46 cold damage unless they succeed a dexterity saving throw in order to have both damages. For a 4th level spell, Ice Storm possesses an exceptional amount of range, doubling that of Fireball, which has a range of 150 feet, allowing you to easily place the spell in more accessible parts of the battlefield. And while the damage of the spell is not the best, it covers the same radius as Fireball, because the spell is shaped like a cylinder rather than a sphere. In fact, it covers more vertical distance than Fireball, making it an excellent tool to both hit ground targets and creatures in the air. There is also a lingering effect when it turns the ground inside the area into difficult terrain until the end of the next turn, which serves as an effective way to impair movement for everything inside of it, halving their movement speeds. Unlike Ray of Frost, creating difficult terrain with this spell does not require any sort of rolls, which is a nice bonus. The reason this spell might not be higher on this list is because the difficult terrain effect goes both ways. While enemies will have a hard time moving out of it, your melee party members will also be unable to move inside of it very easily. This means you must be mindful of where you cast the spell, perhaps place it as close to the edge of your range as possible to make it harder for the backup to arrive while you and your party take care of more immediate threats. The fact that difficult terrain only lasts for a single round can diminish the overall usefulness of the spell, as other 4th level spells like Wall of Fire exist which last for longer. And at number 4, we have Glyph of Warding. This is a 3rd level spell that takes 1 hour to cast and lasts until it's dispelled or triggered, while also sporting material cost of incense and powdered diamonds worth at least 200 gold, which the spell consumes. Casting the spell allows you to create a nearly invisible glyph that you can inscribe on a surface that can either store a prepared spell with 3rd level or lower when casting as part of the created glyph. You can also upcast Glyph of Warding so that you can make it work with higher level spells like Mental Prison or Meteor Swarm, as well as granting it additional flexibility. Or make a rune which explodes in a 20-foot radius sphere centered on the glyph when triggered, dealing 5d8 acid, fire, cold, lightning, or thunder damage on a failed saving throw that you choose when you're making the glyph, or half as much damage on a successful save. This spell also allows you to set any kind of trigger you want for the glyph. You might want the glyph to only affect creatures of a certain type or alignment, for instance. Some very simple triggers you might use, for example, might include something like Fireball Glyph to trigger the moment someone walks into the room the glyph resides in. Or you might want to obscure an escape route so that you can set a Fog Cloud Glyph to trigger whenever you cast Misty Step over it. Perhaps you want to catch a thief, so you have a Glyph of Force Cage set on the chest of a valuable loot which triggers whenever they try to open it without the proper key. There are plenty of more creative ways you can use this spell, which makes it extremely versatile to play within any campaign. This spell also works excellently as a DM spell, because it can allow them to create scenarios and traps specifically catered to the party, and can also allow for some fun puzzles for dungeons as well. But the reason this spell is at number 4 on this list is because it is technically not a cold damaging spell, despite the fact that the exploding rune of the version can do cold damage, which technically makes it qualified for this list. It also can't be any higher on this list because 9 times out of 10, you're never going to use this spell to deal any sort of cold damage, especially when there are better damage types available to the explosive rune. And it's not lower on this list because it has so much fun utility that can be used in many creative ways that are only hindered by the player's imaginations. So it's near the top to let you know that this spell exists and can technically deal cold damage. And at number 3, we have Armor of Agathys. This is a 1st level Warlock spell which creates a magical force around you for 1 hour, granting you 5 temporary hit points and dealing cold damage to creatures that hit you with a melee attack while you possess these temporary hit points for 5 cold damage. The damage and temporary hit points are not something to write home about. However, every time you upcast the spell, you gain an additional 5 hit points and deal an additional 5 points of cold damage for each spell slot used above the first, making it one of the best scaling spells in the game. On top of that, any spells or magical items that can grant you resistance to certain types of damage can help extend the duration of your temporary hit points by allowing you to squeeze out more damage out of the spell. For example, if you cast Armor of Agathys at 4th level, you'll have 20 temporary hit points and deal 20 cold damage to a creature every time it hits you with a melee attack. Then, if you put yourself under the effects of Blade Ward, a cantrip that gives you resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage by weapon attacks until the end of your next turn, so let's say a creature attacks you twice for 20 slashing damage, each for a total of 40 damage. Normally, you would only deal 20 cold damage to the creature because the first attack broke through all of your temporary hit points at once. However, because Blade Ward is halving all slashing damage and weapon attacks, each hit only deals 10 slashing damage for a total of 20 damage total. And since the first hit only deals 10 damage, it isn't enough to take away all of your temporary hit points, but the attacking creature still takes 20 cold damage. The second hit also deals 10 damage, which depletes the rest of your temporary hit points, while dealing another 20 points of cold damage to the creature, netting us a total value of 40 cold damage from this spell. Therefore, to squeeze out as much value of the spell as possible, you're going to want to try to use it as a means of soaking up as many small hits as possible, and there are some other ways that you can do that. Usually, this spell is only available to Warlocks, which makes it not as great to use since you want to save those spell slots for better spells most of the time. Unless you're running a Hexblade Warlock, there's a pretty good chance you're not going to be taking many melee hits unless you get really unlucky. Fortunately, because Armor of Agathys is a 1st level spell, it's easy to obtain for any class simply by taking a single level in Warlock. Doing so grants you access to 2 1st level Warlock spells, including Armor of Agathys. Because of the way spellcasting works in D&D 5e, you can use this spell with your non-Warlock spell slots as well, which functions differently than the spell slots other spellcasters normally have. Using this spell as a Hexblade Warlock or Bladesinger Wizard, there is a fun combo you can do with the Abjuration Wizard class, which is probably the best candidate for maximizing the value of Armor of Agathys. A second level Abjuration Wizard learns a class feature called Arcane Ward, which creates a shield around the wizard the first time you cast an Abjuration spell of first level or higher that day. It lasts until you finish a long rest and has its own hit points, which are considered separate from yours, equal to twice your wizard level plus your intelligence modifier. Whenever you take damage, your ward takes the damage instead. The ward regains hit points whenever you cast a first level Abjuration spell or higher, equal to twice the level of the spell. The most important thing to note about this feature is that the hit points that the ward has are not considered temporary hit points, and take any damage before any other sources of hit points you might possess. This effectively creates a secondary buffer for Armor of Agathys, giving it more opportunities to deal damage because even if the ward takes the damage, you're still getting hit. With 11 levels in Wizard, your Arcane Ward can have a possible maximum of 27 hit points, while your Armor of Agathys would grant you 30 temporary hit points with casting at 6th level, which grants yourself a buffer of 57 hit points as a spellcaster. The Warlock subclass you'd want to go for is Hexblade subclass, since it grants you proficiency in medium armor, shields, martial weapons, allowing you to be more melee oriented during combat, which gives you more chances to get hit by melee attackers. At this point, it mostly becomes about trying to make yourself the most important target in the room, so you might throw out some debilitating concentration spells in order to bait out attacks. Having access to the Warcaster feat can help, since it allows you to have advantage on concentration attacks whenever you take damage. Top that off with Resilience in order to gain proficiency in Constitution saving throws, and you'll effectively have a pretty well-built Mage's Tank, which does an excellent job at making the most out of a first level spell. However, all of this is a huge commitment to make the spell a lot better than it actually is in most circumstances. While you wouldn't get the benefits of Arcane Ward, Bladesinger Wizards as well as Eldritch Knights are also good at making use out of the spell, since both are melee focused with a good amount of AC to block attacks, meaning that attacks that hit will almost always come at the cost for your enemies. So while there is a lot of value to gain in regard to the spell's damage, the fact that you have to have a specific build to get the most out of this spell makes it only take the number 3 spot on this list, even if it is a fun spell to build yourself around. And at number 2, we have Otiluke's Freezing Sphere. This is a 6th level wizard spell which creates a 60-foot radius sphere explosion at a point you choose within a range of 300 feet. Creatures that fail a Constitution saving throw against the explosion suffer 10d6 cold damage, only half as much on a successful save. This spell also freezes bodies of waters, which can make it easier for your party to cross, while also trapping creatures in ice if they're swimming on the surface of the water at the time the spell goes off, in which case they can use their action in order to make a strength check against your spell save DC in order to break free. Alternatively, you can cast a spell to create a small globe the size of a slingstone, which can be given to other creatures that doesn't explode. The globe can be thrown, causing the globe to shatter on impact and explode with the same effect as casting the spell normally. You can also use a sling in order to hurl it farther, since throwing it only has a range of 40 feet when used this way. You can also set the globe down where it will shatter and explode after 1 minute, which can be very useful for setting a trap that has a huge AoE. And speaking of this spell's huge AoE, Otiluke's Freezing Sphere has triple the radius of Fireball, and 2 times the range it can be cast, making this spell very useful for hitting large number of creatures with its massive radius. However, at the same time, the downside of having such a big radius means you must be mindful of friendly creatures so as not to hit them with the blast too. If you want to compare the damage of this spell with Fireball, Fireball definitely deals more damage if you were to upcast it simply at 6th level. However, Otiluke's Freezing Sphere has the range advantage that Fireball doesn't, which can have its uses if you want as much of a map-wide coverage as possible. At the end of the day, this spell only deals damage on a Constitution save, which is generally the worst stat to target since most creatures at higher levels tend to have high Constitution scores. But the fact that the overall range and massive radius is enough to hit so many enemies at once over a very large area, along with the added utility of being able to give this to your friends to launch with slings, is the reason why this spell sits at number 2 on this list. It's also one of the few spells you can prepare during a time stop ability in order to do the most amount of damage with that spell. And at number 1, we have Rime's Binding Ice. This is a 2nd level spell which creates a cone with a range of 30 feet that deals 3d8 cold damage to the creatures inside of it, and reduces their movement speed to 0 unless they succeed a Constitution saving throw, in which case they'd only take half damage as well as having their movement speed unhindered. Already, this spell does so much when it comes to impairing movement and is probably the best spell for doing so, considering it only uses a 2nd level spell slot. Reducing multiple creature movement speed to 0 essentially puts melee-based attackers out of commission for 1 minute. However, creatures can break away the ice that binds them, but it would cost them an action in order to do so, forcing enemies to choose between a less effective range option or wasting their entire action breaking free from their frosty prison can help tip the fight in your favor, since that is a temporary loss of action economy for your enemies. Action economy is important since the more things your party can do in a turn, the more advantage you'll have when it comes to winning encounters. The biggest downside of the spell is that it targets Constitution, which is often the worst stat in the game to target with spells and effects. However, for such a strong effect, this kind of balances out and can work as an alternative form of disruption if you can get more creatures in range than Shatter, another 2nd level spell, also a Constitution saving throw, that deals the same amount of damage to targets as thunder damage, but in a 10-foot radius sphere and with no additional effects. being the most efficient way to impair movement to so many creatures, while also messing up their action economy and maintaining respectable damage to boot, all as a second level spell, is the reason why this spell takes number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and there you have it, the 10 best cold damage spells. If you think there's any spells we may have missed, or have ideas for future videos similar to this one, please let us know down in the comments below.